Rain traced silver lines down the glass walls of Le Marceau, a quiet French restaurant tucked into a side street of Manhattan. The city outside pulsed with hurried umbrellas and yellow lights, but inside, everything glowed warm. Amber chandeliers, the soft hush of a string quartet, the faint scent of baked brioche. At a corner table, Adrian Cole sat alone. Posture straight, suit immaculate, expression still as polished stone. He glanced once at his watch, once at the door, and told himself this would be 20 minutes, nothing more. He disliked blind dates, he despised arrangements. Yet tonight was not for him. It was for Margaret, his mother, 68, her kidneys failing, her voice gentle but persistent. She had asked for a single promise. Meet the young woman from her volunteer clinic. She's kind, Margaret had said, and you need kindness more than you know. So here he was, counting minutes, waiting to keep a promise. At precisely 7:12, the door swung open. A rush of cool air and soft drizzle followed a woman in a forest green dress. No glitter, no perfume cloud, no practiced smile. Her blonde hair was twisted loosely, wisps falling free. Her eyes gray-blue, clear and curious. She spotted him, offered a calm, steady smile, and crossed the room with measured steps. "Nora Blake," she said when he rose. "Adrian," he replied. They sat. Water poured, menus opened, silence settled. She broke it first, voice light but sure. "Your mother warned me you'd hate this." He looked up, one brow arched. "She warned you correctly." Nora laughed softly. "Good, then we're honest already. I'm not here to impress you, Adrian. I didn't Google your company. I didn't plan a clever speech. I came because your mother asked, and I trust her more than I trust dating apps or fate." Her words disarmed him more than charm ever could. Most people performed for him. She simply showed up. He studied her hands folded on the table, unpolished nails, a faint ink stain on her finger, a teacher's mark. "What do you teach?" he asked. "Third grade, which means I spend my days answering cosmic questions and settling arguments about planets." Something loosened in him, a quiet chuckle he hadn't planned. She grinned, eyes alight. "They're exhausting, but they're honest. They don't care about status, only that someone listens." "Do they trust you?" "They trust whoever stays," she said simply. The line struck deeper than it should have. In his world, loyalty was transactional. Trust expired with contracts. Her world ran on presence alone. Nora's voice softened. "Some of my kids come hungry. One saves half his lunch for his baby sister. Another falls asleep in math because she's up caring for her mother. I can't fix everything. I just make sure they're seen, that they matter. And when that's not enough, I still show up the next day." Adrian stared at the candle flame wavering between them. Show up. Stay. Words that tasted foreign, humbling. Then as the waiter cleared plates, Nora asked for a to-go bag. When it arrived, she folded the food carefully, excused herself, and stepped out into the drizzle. Through the window, Adrian watched her kneel beside a man huddled under scaffolding, hand him the bag, touch his shoulder once, then return without fanfare. No speech, no apology, just action. For the first time in years, Adrian forgot his schedule. Minutes passed. They spoke quietly about small things, music, books left half-read, the sound of rain on old rooftops. When the meal ended, he reached for his umbrella. "Let me drive you," he offered. "I'll take the train." Wind whipped down the avenue, scattering leaves and rain across her coat. He held the umbrella anyway, waiting. She hesitated, then nodded. The ride was silent, comfortable in its stillness. Nora gazed through the glass, city lights blurring into watercolor. Adrian found himself glancing at her reflection, steady, unpretending. At her building, she turned with a quiet smile. "Thank you for not leaving right away." Before he could reply, she was gone, footsteps fading into the stairwell. He sat in the car a long moment, listening to the rain, unaware that something small but irreversible had begun. The first crack in the armor he had mistaken for strength, the first echo of a lesson he did not yet understand. The city blurred past in streaks of gold and gray as Adrian guided the car through the rain-slicked streets. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Nora sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, gaze steady on the window where raindrops raced each other toward the glass edge. She didn't check her phone or try to fill the quiet with polite chatter. She simply existed beside him, calm and unhurried, and for reasons he couldn't name, it unsettled him more than any awkward conversation could have. At a stoplight, he glanced at her reflection in the window. She looked peaceful, like someone who wasn't waiting for approval or planning the next thing to say. Most people rushed to impress him, spoke quickly, tried too hard. Nora seemed content to let the silence breathe. When they reached her block, a narrow street lined with aging brick apartments, she turned to him with that same steady smile. "Thank you for the ride, Adrian, and thank you for staying longer than you meant to." Her voice held no teasing, only quiet gratitude. He wanted to say something, anything, to explain the strange calm she left behind, but words didn't come. By the time he found them, she had stepped out into the drizzle, lifted her coat collar, and vanished behind the faded green door. He sat there longer than he should have, watching rain bead across the windshield. Then, shaking himself free, he shifted the car into gear and drove off, convincing himself this would be the end of it. A pleasant evening, nothing more. Morning came with gray clouds and the familiar rhythm of business. Adrian arrived at the East Harlem site, clipboard in hand, his assistant rattling off details about zoning permits and cost projections. He listened without hearing, eyes scanning the cracked concrete lot. Something about the laughter drifting from beyond a chain-link fence drew his attention. Across the street stood a small public school, paint peeling, playground faded. Yet the laughter that spilled over its walls was bright and alive. Curious despite himself, he moved closer, peering through the fence. There she was. Nora stood in the yard surrounded by a cluster of children, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, chalk dust smudged across her skirt. She knelt beside a little girl with brown hair and uneven legs tucked beneath her, guiding her hands as they drew bright suns across the pavement. A small walker leaned against the wall behind them. Adrian froze, the noise of the city fading. Something in the image held him still, the gentleness in Nora's touch, the easy trust in the child's eyes, the way every movement around her seemed to orbit quiet steadiness. The girl looked up suddenly and spotted him, her voice carried across the yard. "Hey, Miss Nora, that's the man from last night." Heads turned, giggles erupted. A boy shouted, "Is he your boyfriend?" Nora blinked, caught between surprise and amusement. She waved lightly. Adrian found himself stepping through the gate before logic intervened, drawn forward by a tide of small voices. Children swarmed around him, tugging at his sleeves, peppering him with questions. Did he drive a spaceship? Did he know Taylor Swift? Could he help build the tallest block tower? He crouched instinctively, answering their wild curiosities with half smiles and nods, the stiff shell of his usual composure slipping away under sticky fingers and laughter. Nora watched from a few steps away, arms crossed, eyes curious but kind. When a bell rang, the children scattered in practiced rhythm, gathering books and backpacks. Adrian straightened, brushing chalk from his suit. "That was unexpected," he admitted. "It usually is," she replied. "They see people as stories, not resumes." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills. "I'd like to make a donation." Nora stepped forward, laying a light hand over his. "We don't take money that tries to buy a place in their lives. If you want to help, come back, sit with them, listen, show up." Her voice was gentle but firm, a line drawn in quiet sand. Adrian paused, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He slipped the bills back into his coat, uncertain for the first time in years what the right move was. "All right," he said softly. Nora nodded once and turned toward the door, guiding the little girl, Ava, inside. Adrian stood alone in the yard, surrounded by fading chalk drawings and echoes of laughter. For a long moment he stayed where he was, the scent of rain and chalk mixing in the cool air. Something within him shifted, small, unfamiliar, but undeniably real. He looked once more at the doorway where Nora had disappeared, then at the worn pavement under his shoes. Maybe 20 minutes wasn't enough. Adrian returned 2 mornings later, uncertain why he had come. The lot across from his development site still looked the same: cracked asphalt, sagging fence, a yard painted with faded hopscotch lines. Yet beyond the gate, laughter bloomed again, unfiltered and bright. He told himself he was only passing by, but his steps slowed until he stood at the edge of the playground. Nora was there, crouched beside a group of children stacking cardboard blocks into a crooked tower. Her hair was pulled back, loose strands brushing her cheek. She didn't see him at first, too absorbed in helping a boy balance the final piece. When the tower wobbled and collapsed, the children erupted in giggles, and she laughed with them, the sound light as wind chimes. Only when the laughter quieted did she notice him. Her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity. Adrian raised a tentative hand in greeting. "You came back," she said as she walked toward him, wiping chalk from her palms. "I was nearby," he answered. "Thought I'd see how the class was doing." "They're the same as always," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. Hungry for attention, allergic to silence. Ava limped up beside her, gripping her small walker, eyes bright. "You're the man with the shiny car," she announced. "Are you rich?" The bluntness made him smile. "I suppose some people would say so." Ava considered this seriously, then nodded. "You should buy us more crayons." Nora shook her head gently. "We have enough crayons, Ava." "No, we don't," the girl protested, pointing to the stub in her hand. "See?" Adrian reached into his coat, pulling out his wallet almost instinctively. "How about I make a donation?" he offered, holding out a few folded bills. Nora's eyes softened, but her voice carried quiet steel. "Put that away," he hesitated. "It's just to help." "That's not how we help here," she said. "We don't take money to buy our way into their trust. If you want to help, come sit with them. Read a story. Build a tower. Show up." The simplicity of her refusal stunned him more than any rejection he'd heard in a boardroom. He slipped the money back into his pocket, fingers lingering on the leather fold, as if unsure what to do with hands accustomed only to transactions. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Don't be sorry," she replied. "Just be present." The bell rang, sharp and cheerful, calling the children inside. Nora guided Ava toward the door, pausing once to glance over her shoulder. "You're welcome to visit again, but leave the wallet next time." He nodded, unable to find words. When the yard emptied, Adrian stood alone beneath the gray sky. The chalk drawings stretched around him like silent invitations. Clumsy suns, stick figures with wide smiles, words spelled phonetically in bright color. None of it cost a cent, yet the space pulsed with something his world rarely touched: belonging without condition. Back at his office, the city noise pressed in. The ring of phones, the clipped voices of analysts, the steady rhythm of deals in motion. Yet his mind lingered on that small playground, on Nora's calm insistence, on the way Ava's hand gripped her walker while still daring to demand more crayons. That evening, long after the building had emptied, Adrian sat alone with the city lights pooling beyond his window. He tried to drown the memory in spreadsheets and contracts, but the numbers blurred. For the first time, he wondered if all the signatures he'd collected could equal the weight of a single promise to show up. He opened his calendar, hovered over the blank squares, and typed in a meeting with no agenda. Visit Nora's class. The next morning, he arrived early, sleeves rolled, not sure what role he was stepping into. Nora greeted him with quiet surprise but said nothing, simply handed him a box of mismatched crayons. The children swarmed him again, laughing, tugging, demanding stories. By noon, his suit bore chalk dust and tiny fingerprints, and his watch lay forgotten in his pocket. When he finally left, Nora called after him, voice gentle but firm. "Helping isn't about what you give, Adrian. It's about what you're willing to share." He turned once at the gate, meeting her gaze. For the first time in years, he felt the faint tremor of something real beneath the polished surface of his life. An unfamiliar urge to stay, to learn, to belong. Days passed, yet the echo of Nora's words lingered. Adrian found himself staring at numbers that no longer spoke the same language. Profits, margins, projections, they once defined his worth. Now they seemed strangely hollow beside the memory of a small girl saving half her lunch or a teacher refusing his money with quiet conviction. One afternoon, he arrived at the school unannounced, a box of storybooks tucked under his arm. Nora was alone in her classroom, the last of the children gone, sunlight spilling across stacks of construction paper and crooked drawings taped to the walls. She looked up, surprised but not unkind. "You came back," she said. He nodded, setting the books down. "Thought the class could use a few new stories. They will love them," she said, touching one gently before meeting his eyes. "But you look like a man with more questions than answers." Adrian hesitated, then gestured toward the small desk in the corner. "May I?" She nodded. He sat, fingers tracing the faint dents in the wood where years of pencils had pressed too hard. "What made you choose this?" he asked quietly. "You're brilliant. You could be running a firm, building something huge." Nora leaned against the desk beside him, arms folded loosely. "I once thought I would." She crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a worn folder, setting it before him. Inside lay a pristine acceptance letter from a prestigious analyst program, a corporate ID badge that had never been activated, and a photograph of a younger Nora standing beside a smiling man in a sharp suit. "That was me 5 years ago," she said. "Fresh degree, big job, a fiancé who promised the world." Adrian studied the photo. What happened? She took a slow breath. Damien Kerr happened. Venture capitalist, charming, ruthless. "At first I believed in his vision. Then I learned his profits came from hollow companies and broken promises. When I confronted him, he told me compassion was weakness." Her voice remained calm, but something old flickered in her eyes. "The engagement ended the same day I walked out of that office. 2 weeks before the program began, I withdrew. I packed a suitcase, rented a one-bedroom apartment, and signed up to teach in a district no one else wanted." "Why here?" Adrian asked. "Because here, every small act matters. A sandwich, a story, a steady hand. You can see the difference by noon. You can feel it when a child who never smiles finally laughs." She opened another drawer and lifted a framed picture. 2 children grinned up from it, one of them Ava, the other a dark-haired boy. "I became a foster guardian after their parents lost custody. They needed someone who wouldn't leave. I promised I'd stay." Adrian stared at the photo, then at her. "You gave up everything." "No," she said softly. "I gave up what never felt real to keep what does." For a long moment he was silent. Outside, the faint rumble of traffic filtered through the window. Inside, the room felt like a different world, one built on presence, not ambition. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You could have chosen comfort, security. I chose meaning," she replied, "and meaning asks for everything." He rose slowly, unsettled by the calm certainty in her tone. In his world, sacrifice was measured in profit margins and sleepless nights, not in walking away from entire futures. Before leaving, he turned once more. "Is there anything your class needs?" She smiled faintly. "Ask them. They'll tell you." That night, he sat alone in his office, the city glittering far below. The folder lay open on his desk, its contents borrowed with her permission. He traced the lines of her acceptance letter, the faint smudge of ink where her signature stopped midway. A single decision, and her life had split from his world completely. He wondered what it would feel like to choose meaning over momentum, to step off the relentless track he had built for himself. By morning, the question still haunted him. Without telling her, he called his legal team and arranged a grant. New equipment, sensory tools, breakfast supplies for every child in her class. He signed it under a foundation's name, leaving his own off the record. It was an attempt to help quietly, to give without being seen. Yet even as he sealed the envelope, a small voice in his mind whispered the truth. She would not be impressed by shadows. She wanted presence, not gestures. Still, he sent it, because it was all he knew how to do. For now. 3 days later, Nora stood in the front office of Coal Industries, rainwater sliding from her coat onto the marble floor. The receptionist looked uneasy, clutching a phone. When the elevator opened, Adrian stepped out, startled to see her waiting there, eyes bright with restrained anger. In her hand was a sealed envelope, creased from being carried too tightly. "You paid for this," she said before he could speak. He froze, glancing at the letter. It bore the seal of a private education foundation, his name carefully omitted. Still, she had found him. "It was anonymous," he said quietly. "Not anonymous enough," she answered. "I asked around. You meant well, but this isn't how it's done." He tried to respond, but she cut him off. "Do you know what happens when someone like you sends money without asking? People assume the program is solved. They stop showing up. They stop listening." Adrian exhaled slowly. "I thought I was helping." "Then, ask first," Nora said. "Show up. Sit with us. Learn what we need before you decide what matters." The receptionist pretended not to hear. Employees passed through the lobby, glancing curiously at the woman standing firm before their CEO. Adrian felt the weight of eyes on him, but none of it mattered. Only her words did. She stepped closer, voice steady. "You can't fix people with money. You can only stand beside them while they fix what they can." He lowered his gaze. "I didn't want recognition. That's not the point. It's about presence. It's about listening." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. The hum of the building felt louder than ever. "You told me to show up," he said finally. "Teach me how." Nora studied him, searching for pretense. Finding none, she drew a slow breath. "Start small. Ask the children what breakfast means to them. Sit in the cafeteria before the bell rings. Watch what disappears first on the trays. Then ask why." Adrian nodded once. "All right." She handed him the envelope. "If you still want to fund something, come back with a plan they helped write. Until then, keep this." He accepted it wordlessly, the paper heavy in his hands. She turned toward the doors but paused. "I don't need a benefactor, Adrian. I need a partner." Then she was gone, swallowed by the rain outside. For a long moment he remained still, the noise of the lobby fading into a blur. Something inside him ached, a quiet understanding of how often he had mistaken solutions for connection. That evening, alone in his office, he opened the envelope again. The grant he'd arranged was generous, enough to transform a dozen classrooms. Yet every figure on the page now felt hollow, stripped of meaning by her refusal. He closed his laptop, pushed the letter aside, and leaned back in his chair. Through the window, the city glimmered, endless towers of glass and ambition. For years he had believed generosity meant writing checks large enough to silence problems. Now he saw the emptiness in that. The next morning he drove to the school before sunrise. The halls were quiet, the smell of chalk and disinfectant lingering in the air. In the cafeteria, a single worker prepared trays of cereal and milk. Adrian rolled up his sleeves and began setting places, the worker glancing at him uncertainly but saying nothing. When the children arrived, sleepy-eyed and shivering in the early chill, he greeted them one by one, watching which foods they chose, which they tucked away to save for later. He listened to their chatter, their small worries, their laughter echoing through the empty room. Nora found him there an hour later, crouched beside Ava, tying a loose shoelace. She stopped in the doorway, studying the scene. "You came," she said softly. "I asked," he replied. They answered. She walked closer, a slow smile forming. "Then keep asking. Keep showing up." He nodded, understanding now that help was not measured in dollars but in mornings like this, quiet, imperfect, real. As the bell rang and the children hurried off to class, Adrian remained behind, gathering crumbs from the tables. The room was empty again, yet something within him felt fuller than it had in years. Outside, the rain had stopped. For the first time, he noticed the light breaking through the clouds. The call came before dawn, slicing through the stillness of Adrian's apartment. His phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand until he reached for it half asleep. The hospital's name flashed on the screen, and suddenly the haze vanished. "Mr. Cole," the nurse's voice was gentle, careful. "Your mother's condition has worsened. We've moved her into intensive care. You should come now." He was out of bed before the call ended, pulling on yesterday's clothes with shaking hands. The drive through the dark streets felt endless, headlights cutting through a fog he barely saw. In the sterile hallway outside the ICU, Adrian paced like a man unmoored. His tie hung loose, his coat unbuttoned. He had conquered boardrooms, silenced competitors, shifted markets with a signature. But here, in the white hum of hospital lights, he was helpless. The doctor emerged quietly, clipboard pressed to his chest. "Complications from heart failure," he said. "We're doing everything we can." Adrian nodded, unable to speak, and sank into a plastic chair near the vending machines. His elbows rested on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He didn't hear the footsteps until someone sat beside him, Nora. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, her eyes soft with understanding. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't offer hollow comfort. She simply sat there, present, steady, a quiet anchor in a storm he couldn't control. After a moment, she stood and slipped into the room without a word. Adrian followed to the doorway, watching. His mother lay small beneath the white sheets, machines blinking rhythmically around her. Nora took Grace's fragile hand, brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead, and began to hum. It was a lullaby, simple and haunting, one his mother used to sing when he was a boy. The melody floated through the room, weaving through the hiss of oxygen and the steady beep of the monitor. Grace's breathing eased. Her lips curved faintly, the first hint of peace in days. Something inside Adrian cracked. He turned away, pressing a hand to his face as tears fell freely for the first time in years. Not the quiet tears of frustration or stress, but raw, unguarded grief. When Nora stepped out moments later, she found him still there, shoulders trembling. She didn't speak, only rested a hand on his arm. He covered it with his own, grateful beyond words for her silence. Hours passed in fragments, nurses moving quietly, doctors murmuring updates, the faint hum of life-sustaining machines. Adrian stayed at his mother's bedside, holding her hand as if afraid to let go. Between those still moments, his mind replayed every conversation he'd avoided, every dinner he'd postponed for meetings, every word he wished he'd said. Success had filled his calendar, not his life. And now, standing at the edge of losing the one person who had always loved him beyond measure, the weight of all that emptiness bore down like lead. When the monitors finally stabilized, exhaustion claimed him. He sat in the hard chair beside the bed, his head resting against the railing. Nora remained in the hallway, sipping cold coffee from a paper cup, watching through the glass as Adrian slept beside his mother. By morning, Grace's condition had steadied, though the doctors warned it was fragile. Adrian thanked them with a hoarse voice, but it was Nora he turned to afterward. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't come," he whispered. "You'd have done what sons do," she replied softly. "You'd have stayed." He looked at her then, really looked. The calm strength in her eyes, the warmth in her presence, the way she carried compassion like a quiet flame that never wavered. In that moment, he understood what she had been trying to teach him all along. That love was not an act or a transaction. It was choosing to stand in the hardest places and remain. Later, as sunlight spilled weakly through the hospital windows, he walked Nora to the elevator. She pressed a gentle hand to his chest, just above the place that hurt most. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she said. "Sometimes, showing up is enough." When she left, Adrian returned to the room and sat beside his mother once more. Her hand was warm in his. The machines hummed softly, a fragile rhythm of hope. For the first time in years he whispered a prayer, not for success, not for control, but for courage to keep showing up, no matter how uncertain the road ahead. The meeting was supposed to define the next decade of coal industries. Executives filled the sleek boardroom, screens alive with projections, voices sharp with ambition. Adrian sat at the head of the table, expression composed, yet his thoughts still lingered on the sterile corridors of the hospital and the quiet hum of his mother's machines. Halfway through a presentation on global expansion, his phone buzzed once, then again, then a third time. He frowned, glancing down. The caller ID read Eastbrook Elementary. He rose without a word, the room still buzzing behind him. Out in the hallway, he answered, "Mr. Cole, this is Principal Alvarez." Her voice trembled. "There's been an accident. Anna Harper was struck by a car just outside the school. She's hurt, not critical, but we can't reach Miss Nora. You're listed as her emergency contact." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then Adrian was moving, his chair abandoned, his briefcase left behind. The meeting, the deal, the empire. None of it mattered. Rain streaked across the windshield as he sped through the city. By the time he reached the school, flashing lights painted the wet pavement in red and blue. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring, umbrellas blooming like flowers against the storm. He pushed through them until he saw her, a tiny figure on a stretcher, brown curls plastered to her forehead, a tear streak cutting through the dirt on her cheek. "I'm here," he said, breathless, kneeling beside her. Anna's eyes fluttered open. "Uncle Adrian," she whispered, voice thin as paper. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I've got you, sweetheart. You're safe now." Paramedics moved around them, efficient and focused, but when they tried to lift the stretcher, Anna whimpered and reached for him again. He climbed into the ambulance without hesitation, settling beside her as the doors closed and the siren wailed to life. He held her hand the entire ride, murmuring promises he wasn't sure she could hear. At the hospital, he refused to stand back. When a nurse reached for the stretcher, he bent down and lifted Anna himself, careful, steady, carrying her as though she were made of glass. The staff exchanged curious glances, some recognizing him, others simply struck by the sight of a powerful man moving with such tenderness. In the exam room, he stayed by her side, brushing hair from her face, whispering reassurance as doctors cleaned the scrapes on her leg and wrapped the bruised knee. "She's going to be fine," one of them said gently. "No fractures, just bruises and a few stitches. She's a lucky girl." Adrian exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a trembling sigh. He hadn't realized until that moment how tightly he'd been holding his breath. When they wheeled her to recovery, he followed, still holding her hand. She didn't let go. Minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps filled the corridor. Nora appeared at the end of the hall, hair damp from the rain, eyes wide with panic. "Is she okay?" she asked, almost tripping as she reached him. He turned, face drawn with exhaustion but calm. "She'll be fine. They're finishing up now." Nora's gaze dropped to his sleeves, still stained with blood, to the way his hands trembled slightly where they rested on the bed rail. Something shifted in her eyes, fear softening into gratitude, gratitude deepening into something wordless. "You stayed with her," she said quietly. "Of course I did," he replied. For a long moment, they said nothing. The beeping monitor filled the silence, steady and sure. Then, as if drawn by gravity, Nora stepped closer. Her hand brushed his, tentative at first, then firm. She didn't speak, but he saw everything in her eyes, the trust, the relief, the quiet realization that the man before her was no longer the one she had first met in that glittering restaurant. Hours passed in stillness. When Anna finally drifted into sleep, Nora and Adrian sat together on the hard bench outside the room, side by side, saying nothing. He had once believed strength meant control, solutions, power. But here, under the pale hospital lights, strength looked different. It was a trembling hand held steady, a promise whispered through fear, a man choosing to stay. As dawn crept over the city, Adrian looked at the hospital grew quiet as evening settled. The halls dimmed to a soft amber glow. Nurses spoke in hushed tones, the rhythmic beeping of monitors filling the silence between footsteps. Inside the pediatric wing, Adrian sat just outside Anna's room, elbows resting on his knees, his suit jacket folded beside him. The adrenaline from the day had faded, leaving behind a heavy stillness. Across from him, Nora sat motionless, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The worry in her eyes had softened, replaced by exhaustion and something gentler. Through the glass, Anna lay sleeping, her small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, the faint hum of the machines surrounding her like a lullaby. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't strained. It felt like a fragile truce between two weary souls. Adrian stood finally and disappeared down the corridor. When he returned, he carried 2 paper cups of water. He handed one to her without a word. She accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you," she murmured. He sank back into the chair beside her, stretching his shoulders, his white shirt rumpled, sleeves rolled past his elbows. He looked less like the man who commanded boardrooms and more like someone stripped bare, a man who had spent every ounce of strength on simply being present. "You didn't have to stay," she said softly. "I know," he answered. "That's why I did." She looked at him, startled by the honesty in his tone. The hours drifted slowly. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting blankets. Adrian never moved far. He sat like a sentinel, eyes fixed on the small figure behind the glass. At times he pressed a hand against the window, as if to reassure himself she was still there, still breathing, still safe. Nora tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time her eyes fluttered shut, she saw the flash of headlights, heard the screech of tires. She turned instead toward Adrian, watching him in the dim light. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, but his posture remained unwavering. "You're good with her," she whispered. He turned slightly. "She trusts you." Adrian gave a faint smile. "She didn't give me a choice." Nora laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. It eased something in the air between them. When the nurse finally dimmed the hallway lights, the quiet deepened. Nora pulled her knees up, resting her chin against them. She closed her eyes. Minutes later, her breathing slowed. She had fallen asleep, curled like a child on the hard bench. Adrian watched her for a long moment. Then he rose silently, removed his coat, and draped it gently over her shoulders. She stirred, but didn't wake. He sat again, leaning forward, hands clasped, eyes on the little girl in the room. Every so often she shifted, murmuring faintly, and each time he reached through the railing to take her hand, until she settled again. The night stretched on. The city outside the window glowed faintly, a blur of light and distance. In the quiet, memories rose, his mother's fading smile, the empty dinners in penthouses that echoed with silence, the hollow victories that had once defined his worth. Now here he was, in a hospital corridor, watching over a child who wasn't his by blood, but had somehow claimed a place in his heart. When dawn broke, pale light spilling across the floor, Nora stirred. She blinked, disoriented, then sat upright as the coat slipped from her shoulders. "You stayed all night," she whispered. He nodded, eyes still on the bed. "She kept squeezing my hand every time I tried to let go." Nora followed his gaze. Anna's small hand rested in his, their fingers intertwined. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. "I know," he answered, "but I wanted to." She turned toward him, her eyes softening. In that fragile morning light, she saw the truth he had been hiding for so long. The vulnerability, the longing to matter beyond wealth or titles. "I'm not like you, Nora," he said after a moment. "I don't know how to be this selfless." "That's not true," she replied. "You're here, that's what matters." He looked at her then, and something unspoken passed between them. A promise not of grand gestures, but of presence, of staying when it counted. As the sun climbed higher, the world began to stir again. But in that quiet corner of the hospital, time felt suspended. Two souls sitting side by side, bound by a night that had changed everything. Morning sunlight spilled softly through the hospital windows, brushing against pale walls and polished floors. The world outside was waking, but inside the pediatric wing, time seemed to move slower, gentler. Adrian sat beside Anna's bed, his posture weary yet calm. Dark circles framed his eyes, and faint stubble shadowed his jaw. His hand rested lightly over Anna's, their fingers still intertwined. She stirred, murmuring in her sleep, and his gaze softened. He hadn't slept a moment, but for the first time in years, the exhaustion didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Across the room, Nora blinked awake on the bench, stretching as the coat slipped from her shoulders. Her eyes landed on the quiet tableau before her. Adrian watching over the child like a guardian who refused to look away. Something deep within her shifted. "You stayed," she said quietly. He turned to her, his voice low. She needed someone to hold on to. Nora rose slowly, stepping closer, her gaze tracing the lines of his face, the gentleness in his movements. This was not the man who had once hidden behind polished suits and closed doors. This was someone raw, human, undone by care. "You didn't have to," she said again, almost a whisper. "I know," Adrian answered, "but I couldn't leave." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was tender, heavy with understanding. He looked down at the sleeping child, then back at Nora. "I used to believe love was just a word people used when they wanted something. But last night, I realized love is presence. It's being here when there's nothing to gain." Nora's throat tightened. She had seen kindness before, fleeting, conditional, but this was different. This was a man learning how to give without expectation. She sat beside him, her voice barely audible. "You're changing, Adrian." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know if I'm changing or finally becoming who I was supposed to be." She watched him, the sincerity in his eyes breaking down the last of her guarded edges. When Anna stirred again, Adrian leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She blinked up at him, confused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You stayed," she whispered. "Always," he replied softly. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. As the nurses came to check her vitals, Nora stepped into the hallway, her hands trembling slightly. She leaned against the wall, eyes closing as a wave of emotion washed through her. She had spent so long building walls to protect herself from disappointment, from promises that dissolved when life grew inconvenient. But here was a man who had chosen to stay in the hardest moment, not because he was asked, but because he wanted to. When she turned back, Adrian was standing in the doorway, watching her. He looked unsure, almost vulnerable. "Nora," he began quietly, "I don't know what kind of man I'm becoming, but I know I don't want to become it without you." The words were not a confession, not a plea. They were an offering. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You don't have to be perfect, Adrian. You just have to show up." He nodded slowly, as though sealing an unspoken promise. Later that morning, when Anna was moved to a private room, they stayed together, helping her settle, adjusting pillows, telling quiet stories to make her smile. Between laughter and silence, the fragile thread that connected them began to weave into something stronger. When Nora stepped out to call the school, Adrian remained behind, sitting by Anna's bed. The child looked at him, eyes curious. "Are you going to stay forever?" He hesitated, then smiled gently. "I'll stay as long as you need me." Anna nodded, satisfied, and drifted back into sleep. As sunlight spilled across the floor, Adrian looked around the small room, its sterile walls now softened by warmth. For the first time, he understood that love was not a destination or a grand moment. It was built in quiet acts, in nights without sleep, in promises whispered through fear. When Nora returned, she found him still there, a calm steadiness in his eyes. Without a word, she sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. The space between them no longer felt uncertain. They didn't need vows or declarations. The choice had already been made. They had shown up, and that was enough. A week later, the city glimmered beneath a pale morning sky as Adrian stepped into the vast glass atrium of the newly renovated community center. Rows of folding chairs filled the open space, banners stretched high above them painted with hopeful words about equity and education. Cameras were being set up, reporters adjusting their notes, curious faces turning as he passed. He wore no tie today, only a dark blazer over an open-collar shirt. There was a calmness in his movements, a steadiness that had not been there before. Beside him stood Nora, her navy dress simple, her hair loosely pinned back. She hadn't wanted to come, preferring to let the work speak for itself. But Adrian had asked her gently, not as a symbol, not for show, but as his partner. When the crowd settled, Adrian stepped up to the podium. The murmurs faded, the hum of the room stilling. He paused a moment, letting the silence settle before speaking. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice resonant, deliberate. "Today is not about coal industries or market expansion. It's about something that began small, so small I almost missed it." Eyes lifted across the room, pens poised, cameras flashing. "I've spent most of my life building things, companies, projects, networks. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that the most important things aren't built with contracts or capital. They're built with care. They're built by showing up." His gaze shifted toward Nora, standing quietly to the side, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "I met someone who reminded me of that," he continued. "Someone who taught me that kindness can move more than money ever will, that presence can change more than power." A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. "That's why today I'm announcing a long-term partnership with local schools and nonprofits to fund classrooms, support teachers, and provide resources for children who have been overlooked for too long." Applause broke through the stillness, scattered at first, then growing, filling the space with warmth. But Adrian raised a hand gently, signaling for quiet. "This isn't just about funding," he said. "It's about listening. It's about learning from the people who show up every day, people like Nora Hayes. He turned slightly, extending a hand toward her. Gasps stirred through the crowd as she stepped forward, hesitant but resolute. "This is Nora," he said with quiet pride. "She's a teacher, a community leader, and the reason I remembered what it means to care beyond convenience." Nora flushed under the lights, but did not speak. She didn't need to. The sincerity in his voice said everything. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then applause rose again, stronger now not for spectacle, but for truth. From the second row, a familiar figure stood. Grace Cole, elegant yet fragile, her scarf draped gently across her shoulders. The crowd parted as she stepped forward, cane tapping softly against the floor. "I'm Adrian's mother," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "And I have never been prouder of my son than I am today." The room fell silent, not because of a speech or a project, she continued, turning to Nora, but because he found someone who sees the world with compassion, someone who reminds him of what matters most. Tears welled in Nora's eyes as Grace smiled. "I would be honored to one day call her my daughter." Applause swept through the hall again, warm and unrestrained. Cameras flashed. Adrian stepped closer to Nora, leaning in just enough that only she could hear. "I thought that blind date would be the last one of my life," he whispered. "I never imagined it would be the beginning of everything." Her breath caught, a laugh trembling through her tears. She didn't answer. She simply reached for his hand. Together they stood before the crowd, not as symbols of wealth or charity, but as two people who had learned the quiet power of presence. As the applause swelled once more, Adrian felt something he had never known before, something no empire could buy, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of love woven through action. In that moment, he understood the truth that had been waiting all along. Real change begins not with grand gestures, but with the courage to care. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over Eastbrook, casting long golden rays across the once empty lot behind the school. Where weeds and broken pavement had been, there now stood the Lighthouse Community Center, its painted letters bright against fresh white walls. Children's laughter echoed through the courtyard as backpacks bounced and sneakers slapped against the pavement. Music drifted from open classroom windows, mingling with the scent of fresh paint and spring air. Nora sat on a low bench beneath an old oak tree, a picture book open across her lap. A circle of children leaned in close, eyes wide, hanging on every word. She read slowly, her voice soft but full of warmth, pausing whenever one of them whispered a question. Her face glowed in the morning light, calm and radiant. Across the yard, Adrian crouched near a group of boys painting a mural on the east wall. His rolled-up sleeves were smudged with blue and green streaks, his hands stained with color. The suit and tie were gone. Today he wore jeans and a linen shirt, the kind of man who had learned to build with more than money. Laughter erupted as one of the boys accidentally splattered paint across Adrian's shoulder. He laughed with them, not as a CEO or benefactor, but as a man at peace. Near the steps, Anna stood in front of a small crowd of parents and teachers, singing into a microphone with a confidence that filled the courtyard. Her prosthetic leg glittered with colorful stickers, catching the light as she moved. Gone was the shy girl who once hid behind Nora's skirt. In her place stood a child who knew she was loved and seen. On a stone bench near the garden, Grace Cole watched the scene unfold. Wrapped in a light shawl, she sipped warm tea, her cheeks rosier than they had been in years. Her eyes followed her son, and pride softened every line on her face. As the song ended, applause rippled through the courtyard. Nora closed the book and looked up, her gaze meeting Adrian's across the yard. He smiled, quiet, steady, full of the kind of joy that needed no words. Later that afternoon, when the last of the children had gone, Nora returned to her classroom to tidy up. Sunlight streamed across the wooden desks, warming the worn surfaces. As she straightened the cubbies, her hand brushed against a folded envelope tucked inside a drawer. Her name was written on the front in familiar handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single note. "Thank you for showing up. I'm not afraid of being alone anymore because you are home." Her breath caught, tears rising unbidden. She pressed the note to her chest, the words sinking deep into her heart. That evening, the garden behind the center transformed beneath string lights and white paper lanterns. Tables were set with simple flowers, the air filled with the scent of lemon cake and wild blooms. Friends gathered, laughter mingling with music from a small speaker. Nora stood barefoot on the grass, wearing a soft cream dress that fluttered in the breeze. Adrian faced her beneath the canopy of lights, his hands trembling slightly as he held hers. There was no stage, no press, no ceremony beyond this quiet moment. They didn't need vows written on paper. Their promises had already been spoken in sleepless nights, in hospital corridors, in classrooms filled with chalk dust and laughter. As he slid the ring onto her finger, Adrian leaned close, his voice low and steady. "Nora, you didn't change my life with money. You changed it with humanity." Her eyes shone with tears, a smile breaking through the trembling. Around them, the children rushed forward, Anna leading the charge with arms outstretched. "We're a real family now," she cried, her voice bright with joy. The crowd laughed as Nora knelt, wrapping her arms around Anna. Adrian joined them, and soon they were surrounded by small hands and laughter, a circle of warmth that seemed to glow in the golden light. For a long moment, time stood still, just love, laughter, and the quiet certainty that they had found home. Adrian looked at Nora, at the children, at the life they had built not from wealth but from presence, kindness, and faith. And in his heart, he knew the truth. The blind date he had once dreaded had become the beginning of everything that mattered. The last of the lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, their soft glow casting halos of light across the garden. Music played faintly in the background, the kind that wrapped itself around laughter and quiet conversation. The celebration had ended hours ago, yet no one wanted to leave. The air was filled with warmth, the scent of wildflowers and lemon cake lingering like a memory that refused to fade. Nora stood near the oak tree, barefoot in the cool grass, her cream dress brushing softly against her ankles. She looked out over the courtyard, the children chasing each other beneath the string lights. Grace, seated by the fountain, smiling at every burst of laughter, and Adrian standing near the mural, his hands still stained faintly with blue paint. He turned when he felt her gaze, and their eyes met across the garden. The noise around them softened until all that remained was the quiet understanding that passed between them. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, steady, like a man who had finally found his way home. When he reached her, he took her hands in his. The night air carried the faint hum of crickets, the whisper of leaves overhead. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Everything that needed to be said had been written in the choices they had made. The nights spent in hospital hallways, the mornings serving breakfast at the school, the days building something bigger than themselves. Adrian brushed a thumb across her fingers, feeling the small weight of the ring he had placed there hours earlier. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the first night we met? I told myself I'd leave after 20 minutes. Nora smiled, her eyes shimmering with the reflection of lantern light. "And you stayed." "I stayed," he whispered, "and I never stopped." She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Around them, the world felt still, as though the city itself was pausing to watch. He looked out over the courtyard, at the laughter and light and life blooming in the place that had once been empty. For years, he had measured success in numbers and contracts, in buildings that touched the sky. But here, in this simple space filled with voices and hope, he realized he had built something far greater. Nora lifted her head, meeting his gaze. "What are you thinking?" "That I spent so long chasing things that never mattered," he said quietly. "And somehow, the one thing I never looked for found me." She reached up, cupping his face gently, her voice a whisper. "That's what love does. It finds you when you stop hiding." He kissed her forehead, holding her close. The lanterns flickered, the stars overhead faint and distant, yet somehow nearer than they had ever been. A few feet away, Anna sat cross-legged on the grass, watching them with sleepy eyes. When Nora called softly, the girl rose and ran toward them, wrapping her arms around both with a laugh that seemed to echo against the night. "Can we stay here forever?" she asked, her voice small but certain. Adrian knelt, meeting her eyes. "Forever starts here," he said. The words hung in the air like a promise. As the garden grew quiet, the three of them stood together, hands clasped, hearts aligned. Grace watched from her seat, tears glistening in her eyes, her smile filled with peace. She knew her son had finally found what she had prayed for all along. Not wealth, not glory, but a life anchored in love. Later, when the last light dimmed and the guests had gone, Adrian and Nora lingered in the courtyard. They walked among the murals painted by the children, each image a reflection of hope. A sun rising, a tree reaching toward the sky, a circle of hands joined together. At the far wall, Adrian paused before a small inscription written in bright letters. It read, "Kindness builds what power cannot." He traced the words with his fingertips, then turned to Nora. She smiled, knowing he understood. "This," he said softly, "this is everything." She took his hand.